God kveld. Good evening. Velkommen til andre arrangement i serien I skyggen av krigen. I will switch to English immediately because of our guest and main speaker, whom you don't see here in the room. He's sitting, stay put in London, where he tried to enter a plane to Oslo today, but didn't manage to enter. So we still face some consequences of Brexit, as it looks like. But that means that we today will have a hybrid event. Some of us being present here in the room, and David being present on the screen. Before I start, I was asked to give some information on security here in the room. Jeg vil gi dette på norsk og lese det opp. Velkommen til Gamle Festsal. For å bevare rommets kulturminne ber vi publikum om å ikke nyte mat og drikke I lokalet. Ved evakuering av salen skal en av disse 4 utgangene brukes til høyre og venstre ved scenen og til høyre og venstre side på galleriet. Alle merket med grønne exit-skilt. Vi har brannslanger ved nødutgang til høyre og venstre ved setene og på galleriet ved nøddørene. Det var sikkerhetsinstruksen. So I continue to introduce today's topic, which is the theme of this evening is Holocaust, antisemitism and racism, and the question if the struggles against antisemitism and racism still are two sides of the same thing. And when preparing for this event, I stumbled over a document, a quite important document for our field, Holocaust education and everything we're talking about today, which is the so-called Stockholm Declaration, which was the final declaration of the Stockholm Conference on Holocaust Remembrance, a high-level conference held in Stockholm in 2000, which was attended by 46 heads of state. This was what really put Holocaust remembrance on the international agenda. And I want to quote from the final declaration, which you can say is the founding document of what today is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Paragraph 1. The Holocaust, Shoah, fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization. The unprecedented character of the Holocaust will always hold universal meaning. After half a century, it remains an event close enough in time that survivors can still bear witness to the horrors that engulfed the Jewish people. Paragraph 3. With humanity still scared by genocide, ethnic cleansing, racism, antisemitism, and xenophobia, the international community shares a solemn responsibility to fight those evils. As we see in this document, which is a founding document, a central reference document to the entire field we are working in, it formulates a kind of global consensus, which places the particular Jewish historical experience as a central reference point for the universal fights for human dignity and human rights and against all kinds of prejudice and bigotry. 1 year after the Stockholm Conference, the Center for Studies of Holocaust and Religious Minorities here in Norway was founded as a result of the restitution process related to the properties stolen from Norwegian Jews who were deported and killed during the Holocaust. The center and its broad mandate mirror the double orientation in the Stockholm Declaration and the consensus at that time. It commemorates the Holocaust as Norwegian history with Norwegian victims, perpetrators, and victims involved, and as an event with universal meaning, related to the defense of human dignity, human rights, and the fight against any kind of prejudice. At the time, in the beginning of the 2000s, it was the thing most natural to have this broad focus for a center like ours, which is reflected in the work that the center has done for 20 years. And it was in line with the expectations towards this center in the Norwegian public. But today, things seem to have changed. We now see tensions which haven't been that visible before, and this is especially visible and urgent after the escalation of the conflict, of the Israel and Palestine conflict after October 7 and the subsequent war in Gaza, which is, among others, illustrated by the fact that on November 9th in 2023, a long tradition of common commemoration and demonstration regarded to this day of remembrance, a cooperation between the Anti-Racist Center in Oslo and the Jewish community in Oslo was no longer possible. As it seemed, the fight against antisemitism and the fight against racism were no longer two sides of the same coin. It seemed as if one had to need to decide, take sides for or against the fight against antisemitism or racism, for or against Israel or Palestine. What has brought about this change? In order to explore this question, we have invited our speaker of today. David Feldman is the director of the Birkbeck Institute of the Study of Antisemitism and a professor of history. He is specialized in the history of antisemitism, Jewish history, the history of racialization, and the history of migration in modern Britain. And he has, as a very important part of his experience, led a European project exploring contemporary antisemitism in Western Europe, and has advised at the policy level issues connected with antisemitism, among others, in the United Nations, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and Human Rights Watch. So we think that Mr. Feldman will be able to provide us of a kind of bigger picture and maybe also the longer lines. Maybe he can show us that this change which we observed didn't come all of a sudden. It has been building up for a long time. I will also introduce the two persons who will respond to Mr. Feldman's lecture. They will have responses immediately after the lecture. So I introduce them now and don't need to interrupt then. The first one out will be my colleague Alexa Döving, who is a senior researcher at the Holocaust Center. And she has conducted extensive research on majority societies' attitudes towards various minorities, the consequences of such attitudes, and experience of lived life as a minority. She has recently led a research project called Negotiating Jewish Identity, Jewish Life in 21st Century Norway, and she was one of the curators of the exhibition Unvisible, Everyday Racism in Norway. She will be able to provide us a very important Norwegian take on the question how antisemitism and racism are related. And then we are very happy to also welcome our, I have to say, former and probably hopefully future colleague Madi Degnes, who currently is postdoctor at the Norwegian Folk Museum. She conducted a PhD at the HL-senteret with a study on young Norwegian Jews' relation towards the Holocaust remembrance as private and public memory. She also worked as an educator at the HL-senteret and will be able to provide us important insights in how Holocaust memory and commemoration is negotiated in different settings here in Norway. So without more ado, I will give the word to David. Oh yes, I forgot to say, there was a QR code, meaning that you can send questions. They will be received by my colleagues who will then communicate them to me. And this QR code, I think, will also be shown after the lecture. So today we will make sure that some of your questions also will be answered. David, your turn.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. And yeah. And I hope my PowerPoint is visible. If there's a problem, please let me know. Okay. Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation. To speak today, and for the introduction. I'm only sorry, and I have to say, as it turned out, very surprised that I'm unable to be with you today in person. As Claudia said, it was an unexpected consequence of Brexit that I encountered at the airport gate. When we think about anti-Semitism today, we do so in the shadow of not one, but two wars. Most obviously, we meet today in the shadow of the brutal war on Gaza, launched by Israel after the slaughter and the hostage-taking on the 7th of October 2023, led by Hamas. However, our understanding of anti-Semitism has also been shaped by another more distant war and its aftermath, the Second World War, and specifically by the Holocaust. In the decades after 1945, the Holocaust appeared to many to be the key to creating a consensus, not only against anti-Semitism, but also against prejudice and racism generally. In other words, the attempt to combat anti-Semitism in those decades had a universal significance and was part of a single fight against bigotry. Today, in contrast, it is the disconnections between anti-racism and what we can call anti-Semitism that are most visible. We find this rupture in the divergent responses to the 7th of October 2023 and its aftermath. For many Jews, Zionists and their non-Jewish allies, the attack of the 7th of October was an act of specifically anti-Semitic terror. What is this? Some pogrom in Lithuania? Asked Amit Halevi, the chairman of Be'eri, a kibbutz that lost 10% of its civilian population in the massacre that day. Others have drawn connections between that day and the Holocaust. They claim that Hamas today expresses the anti-Semitism of extermination, that it is a replication of Nazi anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Yet, much of the anti-racist left presents these events in a different key. Amnesty International did denounce Hamas's attacks on civilians, but it located the roots of the violence in Israel's 16-year blockade of Gaza and a system of discrimination against Palestinians that, it said, amounts to the crime of apartheid. By invoking apartheid, Israel's critics affiliate Palestinian resistance with the resistance against the former racial state in South Africa. These conflicting visions not only divide responses to the events of the 7th of October, but also to the death, destruction, and displacement that Israel has brought to Gaza. With heavy symbolism, it was the government of post-apartheid South Africa that brought the charge of genocide against Israel before the International Court of Justice. Demonstrations across the world accuse Israel of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. In court and on the street, Jews and Israel, the Jewish state, no longer feature as victims of a foundational genocide perpetrated by the Nazis and their allies, but are accused of perpetrating a genocide of their own. Israel's ministers and mainstream diaspora Jewish organizations, for their part, focus on anti-Semitism and invoke the memory of the Holocaust. You will recall how Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, Gilad Erdan, appeared at the United Nations Assembly wearing a yellow star. The war on Gaza, these people insist, is a necessary and legitimate response to an existential threat. This conflict reverberates in many local contexts. Since October the 7th, 2023, there has been a sharp spike in recorded anti-Semitic incidents from France to Austria and from Denmark to Italy. One issue here is the existence of anti-Semitism on the left, including within the anti-Zionist movement. A second problem is that some on the left have found it difficult to recognize anti-Semitism as a form of racism, let alone to respond to it adequately. Many Jewish people are locked in a conflict with others who identify themselves as anti-racists. How did the struggle against anti-Semitism come to be separated from anti-racism in this way? To answer this question, we must first ask what we mean by anti-Semitism and what we mean by racism. In 1926, the Dutch Jewish journalist Frits Bernstein, who went on to become a government minister in Israel after 1948, Bernstein asked, why is it that we can distinguish with complete confidence between a live cat and a dead one, but we cannot tell with the same degree of certainty whether an incident that many people regard as unquestionably anti-Semitic really deserves that designation or not? Bernstein's question anticipated our disagreements today. The answer to his question is that, unlike a dead cat, anti-Semitism is a concept. It is a term we use to group together phenomena which we believe share a common quality and so belong together. Whereas we can determine whether a cat is alive or dead by a simple test, we cannot settle whether or not something is anti-Semitic in the same way. When we call something anti-Semitic, in other words, we are not simply holding a mirror up to the world, we are offering an interpretation, and interpretations can differ. Because anti-Semitism and also racism are both concepts, ways of comprehending the world, they also have a history. There is a moment when they came into use, after which they evolved. The word anti-Semitism did not mean the same thing in the 19th century as it has come to mean today, as we shall see. And so the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-racism hinges on the history of these terms. And if we explore the changing meanings of these terms, I want to suggest we will learn something which helps us to understand better both the past and our difficult present. Jewish people have experienced adversity and antipathy for millennia. But it was only after 1880 that terms such as anti-Semite, anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitic began to circulate widely, first in Germany and then across the world. In 1879, Wilhelm Marr created the League of Anti-Semites. Jews in Germany had been granted equal rights in 1871, and for Marr and his supporters, this was a grave error. To protect Germans and German culture from domination by Jews, or what they perceived as domination by Jews, they called for an end to equality for Jews. This was the onset of the self-proclaimed anti-Semitic political movement. Jewish people and their allies swiftly adopted the terms anti-Semitism and anti-Semites to refer to their enemies in Germany and others who questioned equality for Jews. But they didn't use the term for all prejudice and violence directed against Jews. In a long essay published in 1911 in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, Lucian Wolff contrasted the anti-Jewish campaign in Germany with pogroms in Russia. The pogroms were not an example of anti-Semitism, he explained. He understood they were anti-Jewish, but they were essentially a medieval uprising, he said, animated by religious fanaticism. Anti-Semitism reached back no further, he said, than the late 19th century. The campaign against anti-Semitism was a campaign for equal rights for Jewish people. The pogroms in Russia were not anti-Semitic in the eyes of Wolff and many, many others, because Jews in Tsarist Russia, unlike in Bismarck's Germany, did not have equal rights in the first place. In the 1930s, Nazi Germany would commence a radical assault on the rights of Jewish people. Between 1933 and 1939, the Nazi regime issued 400 decrees and regulations diminishing Jewish rights. By 1941, it had embarked on its attempt to exterminate Europe's Jews. The assault on the rights of Jews had reached the right to life itself. And what of the concept then of racism? In the English language, the term can be traced to the beginning of the 20th century, but it was only after the triumph of National Socialism in Germany that the term racism became widely used. And at that time, racism referred specifically to the biologically based ideology, policies and governance promoted by the Third Reich. Opposition to Nazism and its pseudo-scientific justifications generated the idea that racism is based on a myth whose force should be countered and opposed by scientific scrutiny. This critique of racism became integral to the project of reconstructing the world after 1945. In particular, this was a task undertaken by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, better known as UNESCO. UNESCO's constitution stated that the great and terrible war, which has now ended, had been made possible by the doctrine of the inequality of men and races, and by ignorance and prejudice. By taking the Nazi regime as the paradigmatic case of racism, UNESCO helped to establish an influential post-war understanding of racism as something driven by bad ideas, by myths. The official UNESCO statement on race, entitled The Race Question, published in 1950, held that there was no evidence to connect racial differences to the mental characteristics or the cultural achievements of different human groups. The idea was a myth, UNESCO proclaimed, and this approach carried the hope that racial prejudice would collapse once the false nature of racial doctrines had been exposed. At this time, therefore, the struggle against anti-Semitism and the struggle against racism appeared as two fronts in a single war. Anti-racism and anti-Semitism were understood to be struggles against prejudice based on myth. And if the problem of prejudice lay in pseudoscience, then a remedy could be found in good science, in education, and the promotion of equality before the law. This was the time of the alliance between the Black movement for civil rights in the United States and the support for it provided by liberal and progressive Jews. The ways in which the Holocaust was remembered in Western Europe and the United States became an important element reinforcing this union between anti-racism and anti-Semitism. This drew strength from the way in which, from the 1960s, Holocaust memory was invested with a universal and not solely a Jewish meaning. And I want to illustrate this by looking briefly at the history of Holocaust memorialization in Britain. In the 1950s, memorialization of the Holocaust by British Jews was fragmented. In 1953, the year of the 10th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, there were 4 separate commemorative events in London. These were gathering to mourn the millions murdered by Nazis and the heroism of Jewish resistance fighters. But in the early 1960s, the practice of commemoration underwent far-reaching change, not only in Britain, but across the West. The foundations for this development were laid in Israel. First, on the 7th of April 1959, the Knesset passed a law for a day of remembrance of Holocaust and heroism. The new law initiated a new state-sanctioned phase of Holocaust memorialization in Israel. Without intending to do so, it also stimulated new initiatives in Jewish communities outside of Israel. The second way in which Israel created conditions for a new sort of memorialization was through the detention and trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 and 61, which ignited wide interest in the Holocaust across the globe. This was the context in which Jewish organizations transformed Holocaust commemoration in London. After the Knesset decree, London's Jewish community leaders organized a Holocaust commemoration event in a prestigious theatre in the fashionable West End of London, and this became an annual event. These annual occasions were marked by ritual, by solemnity, and by elevated speeches from members of parliament, from government ministers, from leading academics and newspaper editors, as well as from Jewish leaders. Now the memorial event not only addressed Jews and their pain, but also the non-Jewish world. And as this happened, so Holocaust memory was presented with universal meanings. In 1962, Barnett Janner, a Labour member of Parliament and the secular leader at the time of British Jews, gave a speech which provides one clear example of this. He said, "The determination that the principles of democracy and freedom and universal brotherhood, which are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the very fibre of this country, must be defended with unceasing vigilance at all costs in the spirit of the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto against all forces of tyranny and oppression." So there you have a clear connection between Holocaust memory and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the 1960s and 70s, support for Zionism and a rose-tinted perception of Israel sat comfortably with this conception of anti-racism. The leaders of diaspora Zionism presented the Jewish state as a step forward not only for Jews, but for humanity, compatible with the reassertion of equal rights that would make the world safe for everyone. Morris Perlzweig, a senior official of the World Jewish Congress, stated eloquently that just as the liberty of every individual must be limited by the equal rights of other individuals, so the emancipation of a national group must be limited by the rights of other national groups, however feeble. He said this in 1952. And in 1967, he claimed that Israel passed this test. Every Arab citizen, as an Israeli citizen, has exactly the same rights as every Jewish Israeli citizen, he said. And this was a time in the 1960s when support for Israel was a shibboleth of West European social democratic politics, including in Norway. The universal message from the Holocaust reached its zenith in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War. Following the reunification of Germany in 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Bloc in 1991, Holocaust memory played a strategic role in the ideological reconstruction of Europe. With communism vanquished, the fight against anti-Semitism was now imagined to guarantee human rights and toleration, because democracy after 1945, it was said, was built on the defeat of the Nazis. Holocaust memory and Holocaust education was an entry card now for East European states seeking recognition from the West. In 1998, the Swedish Prime Minister Göran Persson, with the support of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, created the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research. Created on the initiative of centrist political leaders after the end of the Cold War, this was the forerunner of today's International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And the project of Holocaust memory was framed as part of a battle against the resurgent far right in Europe. The Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust, convened in 2000, which Claudia mentioned before, coincided with the invitation issued by the Austrian Chancellor, Wolfgang Schüssel, to enter a coalition with Jörg Haider's Freedom Party. Haider's party was the second largest in the Austrian parliament. In addition to his militant stand against immigration, he was notorious for his refusal to condemn Austria's Nazi past, his refusal to condemn his own anti-Semitic statements, or for the attendance at meetings of his party of former SS officers. The BBC reported the Stockholm Forum was a world alert for the rise of the far right. In this context, overcoming anti-Semitism and learning the lessons of the Holocaust became central to the self-justification of the European Union, expressed, for example, in Brussels in February 2004 by Romano Prodi, President of the European Commission. The Shoah, he said, was the worst crime ever committed on European soil. And what he called the European idea was based on a determination to ensure that the Europe of the future would be different, that it would be characterized by tolerance and respect for human rights. And racism, he said, xenophobia and anti-Semitism are a clear violation of all the Union stands for. So this was the high watermark of universalism. But by the time Prodi spoke in 2004, this idea that anti-racism and anti-Semitism were fundamentally in alliance was already falling apart. In the early part of this lecture, I explained how in post-war Europe, support for Israel went together with opposition to anti-Semitism and to racism. This union stood on three legs. First, the idea that racism was rooted in a collection of myths, epitomized by Nazi ideology. Second, equal rights held the remedy for racism. And third, that Zionism is a liberal doctrine and a necessary response to endemic anti-Semitism. It was part of the solution, not part of the problem. But by 2004, this was increasingly being questioned. Part of the explanation for this change is that the image of Israel projected by liberal Zionists and European social democrats was not the whole picture. You will remember that in 1967, Morris Pelsweig claimed that Israel's Arabs enjoyed perfect equality. But in truth, until a year earlier, they had lived under martial law. The foundation of the State of Israel, moreover, had led to the Nakba and the displacement of roughly 700,000 people, about one half of the Arab population of Mandate Palestine. After displacement came dispossession. In 1949, a year after the foundation of the State of Israel, only 13.5% of the land in Israel was in Jewish hands. By the 1960s, this figure was 93%. So obviously there was a massive transfer of land from Arabs to Jews. After 1967, Israel became an occupying power. The number of Jewish settlers colonizing the West Bank rose slowly at first, from 1,500 in 1967 to 53,000 in 1985. The number grew at speed after that to 281,000 in 2004, and today stands at over 700,000 if we count East Jerusalem. Yet this does not explain why the ties between anti-Semitism and anti-racism came undone. After all, the process I've just described began in 1948, and that long predates the unraveling, the falling apart. There were other changes. Other changes that gradually led some on the left to look at relations between Israel and the Palestinians in a new way. The conception of racism changed, and so too did the conception of anti-Semitism. The meaning of racism was transformed slowly by anti-colonial and post-colonial intellectuals and political leaders. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, opened his 1963 book, Africa Must Unite, with a quote from another book called Capitalism and Slavery, written in 1944 by Eric Williams, a historian and later Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Slavery, Williams wrote, was not caused by racism. Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. Under this way of seeing things, the conception of racism moved away from Nazism and the Holocaust. Racism was not caused by bad science, by myths and bad ideas, but by capitalism and by state power. In 1975, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 3379, in which it determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. And this resolution showed the signs. It bore the mark of this other conception of racism. The resolution passed by 72 votes against 35, with 32 abstentions, because by then racism had come to be associated with colonialism. The 1975 resolution was revoked in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, but a decade later, the United Nations was again dominated by the claim that Zionism is racism. This happened at the 2001 United Nations World Conference Against Racism held in Durban in South Africa. This marked a rupture, a break between the politics of anti-Semitism and international anti-racism. Two contentious issues surfaced at the Durban conference and at the NGO forum, which came before it. The conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, and the issue of reparations for slavery and colonialism. In the minds of activists and third world politicians and intellectuals, these issues were connected. The debate over reparations dealt with the legacy of colonialism and racism from the past. The debate over Israel-Palestine turned on whether that conflict was about racism and colonialism in the present. So by now, the politics of race had been transformed. For an increasingly influential global bloc, Israel and its supporters were part of the problem. The final declaration from Durban named Palestinians as victims of racism and racial discrimination. The NGO declaration went further, calling Israel a perpetrator of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid. The United States and Israel walked out of the conference when they realized they could not change the Israel critical language. The walkout also prevented proper discussion of the issue of reparations for slavery. Some Black Americans argued that the United States government displayed more concern for its ally Israel than for the suffering of African Americans, who were its own citizens. A vivid example of the bifurcation of combating anti-Semitism and combating racism. Jewish civil society was filled with alarm by Durban, not least because of the anti-Semitism that was evident at the NGO forum, where the protocols of the Elders of Zion were openly on sale. The Durban conference illustrated the vitality of anti-Jewish narratives and stereotypes in the context of anti-Zionism. Israel and Jewish NGOs responded to this moment with a series of initiatives intended to shift the world's understanding of what anti-Semitism means. After the Durban conference, Israel and Jewish NGOs developed and promoted a new conception of anti-Semitism. Whereas the struggle against anti-Semitism had previously taken aim at attacks on the rights of Jewish individuals and Jewish groups of individuals, and so was part and parcel of an anti-racist politics that promoted toleration of all minorities, now anti-Semitism was also aimed at protecting a state, Israel, from political attack. This change took a number of forms, but the most significant was the working definition of anti-Semitism launched in 2005 by Jewish NGOs and academics in collaboration with the European Union Monitoring Commission on Xenophobia and Racism. In 2016, this became the basis for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. And this is the definition favored today by mainstream Jewish communities all over the world. It has been adopted by 43 states and by hundreds of governmental and intergovernmental institutions and civil society organizations. The definition states that anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred of Jews. This is rather vague. The largest part of the text, though, is taken up by examples that, taking into account the overall context, could be considered instances of anti-Semitism. And some of these, not all, some, cover aspects of anti-Zionism or severe criticism of Israel. The working definition aims to redefine anti-Semitism in two vital ways. First, it does not place the struggle against anti-Semitism within a framework of general principles that safeguards the rights of minorities more broadly. In other words, it departs from the Stockholm principles which Claudia mentioned at the beginning of this evening. The universal meanings of the fight against anti-Semitism were now diminished. Second, the definition extends the scope of anti-Semitism beyond protecting the equal rights of Jewish people to encompass protection for the Jewish state and certain sorts of criticism of Israel and of Zionism. The definition as it was written comes with safeguards. Accusations of anti-Semitism, it says, need to be assessed according to context and whether they correspond to the core definition that I mentioned earlier. But in practice, these safeguards are often forgotten, and the definition has been used to delegitimize points of view critical of Israel or in support of Palestinian rights, and it has been used to undermine academic freedom and freedom of speech. Of course, the IHRA also has many supporters and defenders in the leadership of Jewish communities and in governments. How effective, we can ask, has the definition been in defending Jews or deterring anti-Semitic attacks? Not very, we have to say. Across Europe, there are now rising numbers of anti-Semitic incidents recorded, both by the police and by Jewish civil society organizations. Many Jewish people are concerned for their safety and security, and equally important, concerned at what they perceive to be a lack of empathy for their concerns and well-being, especially on the part of the left. And one part of the problem is indeed the existence of anti-Semitism on the left, including within the anti-Zionist movement. And the second problem is that some on the left have found it difficult to recognize anti-Semitism as a form of racism, let alone to respond to it adequately. This problem goes back to Durban and to the changing way that racism is understood. The dominant paradigms for making sense of racism are now based on the legacies of colonialism and slavery. They are color-coded and they reject white privilege. These paradigms leave to one side the history and ongoing significance of anti-Semitism. They tend to position Jewish people as white and therefore not among the victims of racism. Israel, Jewish leaders and their allies counter by insisting on the special status of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust and its difference from racism. The Holocaust has been invoked repeatedly in the months since the slaughter of civilians and the hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas. It was, said Joe Biden and many others, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Benjamin Netanyahu, at a press conference with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, presented Hamas as the new Nazis. By this reckoning, Israel's war in Gaza is just the latest phase in the unceasing war against anti-Semitism. The invocation of the evils of Nazism and the Holocaust opens the way to saying that any response by Israel, however punitive, whatever its impact on civilian populations, can be justified. What this ignores, of course, is that the slaughter on October the 7th, horrific as it was, emerged from a context in which the relationship of Jewish people to state power was completely different from the one that led to the Holocaust. In Israel-Palestine, there is a history and a current practice of discrimination, displacement and dispossession in which Jewish people are the beneficiaries and not the victims. As we have seen, the 7th of October and the period since have accelerated divisions which have been clearly visible since 2001. Since Durban, with growing frequency, Israel is presented by its critics on the left as an expression of racism and settler colonialism. Among Jewish supporters of Israel and their allies, anti-Semitism has been redefined so that it is no longer only about the rights of Jews, but also about the interests of a state. Inevitably, this deepens and extends divisions between the struggle to combat anti-Semitism and the politics of anti-racism. This point will be illustrated vividly next week when Israel's government will host an international conference combating anti-Semitism held in Jerusalem, to which it has invited a roster of far-right politicians, including figures from the National Rally in France, from Vox in Spain, Sweden's Democrats, and Hungary's Fidesz. These are political parties with pasts rooted in Europe's far right. Their political programs focus on resentments and fears directed against immigrants and Muslims. They are opponents of pluralism and of anti-racism, but they are now invited to Israel as friends and honoured guests and as allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. But this is not the whole story. Today, increasing numbers of Jewish people grapple with the contradiction between the ideas and practices of anti-racist politics and the policies and actions of the State of Israel. There are many responses to this tension. Some Jewish people have become further entrenched in political activism in defense of Israel and its policies. On the other side, a growing minority are alienated from Israel and from Zionism. In the UK today, between a quarter and 1/3 of Jews define themselves as either non-Zionist or anti-Zionist. Among the young, those between 16 and 29, only 49%, a minority, define themselves as Zionists. This development indicates a new direction within Jewish politics, one we see taking place certainly in the UK and the United States, expressed by groups such as If Not Now and Na'amod, whose opposition to anti-Semitism is coupled to a wider anti-racist politics and to criticism of Israel. of Israel's policies. One question is whether this emerging current of Jewish opinion will continue to grow or not. Overcoming the legacy of apprehension many Jewish people feel about the left will not be easy. Finding a consistent anti-racism, which also reckons with emotional attachments to Jewish life in Israel, will be hard. Yet from those Jews who join Palestine solidarity marches, to those whose discomfort with Israel's actions does not yet take a public form, increasing numbers of Jewish people are struggling to navigate the growing tension between anti-racism in Europe and the question of Palestine. This marks an opportunity to link Jewish support for anti-racism with a commitment to justice for Palestinians, as well as to equality and respect for Jewish people, both in Europe and in Israel-Palestine. This politics will require a renewed politics of anti-racism, one capable of addressing the specificities and the harms of anti-Semitism, as well as the racism of the Israeli state. Holding these conversations and building these bridges will be hard, it will take work and persistence. Today, however, there are signs that a social force capable of doing just that is taking shape. Thank you for listening.
Er den på? Den er på. Thank you, David Feldman. Listening to you, I thought about a TV series I just saw on Netflix called Lady in the Lake. Is it something strange with the sound? It's okay. It's echoing a bit. Well, the scene is a woman. She's standing outside a public pool in the US, and behind her is a huge sign, and it says, "No Negroes, no dogs, no Jews." And the lady, she turns towards the camera and she smiles while she puts a piece of tape on the no Jew part of the sign. And she says, "Haven't you heard it? We've become white now." And the fact that Jews not only became white, but also became more or less classless, I think have contributed quite a lot to the fact that anti-Semitism and anti-racism seldom engage with each other perspectives. This, of course, in addition to the factors that David Feldman has addressed. Well, I will use my time on Norway and how anti-Semitism has had a shifting role in the understanding of racism. And I will start by recalling the 1980s and the 1990s. At that time, the fight against racism was almost synonymous with the fight against neo-Nazism. We had movements like the Boot Boys and the National Front, and even if their targets of hate were the new immigrants, blackheads or svartskaller, as they were called, anti-Semitic tropes were a distinct part of their rhetoric, especially the image of the Jew pulling the string of migration to water out the white Norwegian race. A visible kind of racism led to a visible kind of anti-racism. And because the racists were very visible neo-Nazis, the anti-racist movement addressed the proximity between racism and anti-Semitism. Then came 9/11, the terror attack in the States, 2001, and the rise of Islamophobia. I should also add here that the neo-Nazis group had become very marginalized in Norway by this time. And in Norwegian public life, the fight against racism quieted down. The public discussions mostly centered around to what extent Islamophobia was actually something different from critiques of religion. This is a very brief history lesson, so I'll jump right to 22nd of July 2011, the right-wing terror attack in Oslo and Utøya. The perpetrator was motivated by conspiracy theories where Muslims were portrayed as the internal enemy, and comparison
was made to anti-Semitic conspiracies. Some people argued that pointing out such similarities could contribute to relativizing anti-Semitism, but I really do believe it rather revitalized the knowledge of anti-Semitism, and it emphasized the importance of ensuring it was not forgotten about. In the years after the terror attack, focus in the Norwegian public was on extremism rather than on racism as such. But anti-Semitism was actually quite often debated, and then with a focus on the content of anti-Semitic stereotypes rather than references to Israel or to Zionism or anti-Zionism. So this debate was not really very a big part of the anti-racist debates in Norway. Then we had Black Lives Matter. It reached Norway the spring 2020. And with that movement, the awareness of everyday racism being also a Norwegian problem. It was taken seriously, I would say, with focus on experiences of different visible minorities. Since then, especially in schools and different workplaces, it has been a focus on learning about racism, understanding its consequences, and how to react towards racism. 3 years after Black Lives Matter, 7th of October, and the war in Gaza happened, and what Feldman has described as a division between anti-Semitism and anti-racism with regard to Israel and Palestine really came to the surface in Norwegian anti-racist organizations. These tensions has probably been there for a long time, but it became suddenly very visible. But since I haven't studied anti-racist movement specifically, I will now move on to what is my main argument in this talk, namely that the newly acquired knowledge about racism can be an important tool in anti-Semitism, also in these very highly politicized times. Anti-Semitism as a field of knowledge has, to a lesser extent, a set of sub-concepts to nuance what we are talking about when we discuss anti-Semitism. This also makes the space for understanding and combating anti-Semitism smaller. Within, let's call it the language of understanding racism, we work with concepts such as unintended racism, everyday racism, racialization, structural racism, microaggression, minority stress, majority privileges, which helps expand the field. I really do believe that many of these concepts and perspectives can offer insights into anti-Semitism as a phenomenon, not least in how it is experienced and how we should confront it. When a Jewish schoolgirl finds a note on her desk telling her, "You are killing babies," this should be reacted to at the same way as racism is met in the classroom. But stories are told about how teachers see incidents like this as an example of how a terrible war has trickled down into the classroom, and they struggle with how to react. In an interview project with Jewish Norwegians, where I ask about their experiences after October 7, the word racism often comes up, surprisingly often, actually. That is, the informants use it to describe their experiences. I will read a few short examples. A young girl says, "It is as if anti-racism has lost track of us. It has forgotten that we are a vulnerable minority." And she continues, "I often think that what I have experienced is more like everyday racism, because, like, you're not always sure if it's said on purpose, but it's definitely prejudiced." A middle-aged man put it this way: There is a lot that is unique about antisemitism, but we would have benefited from connecting it to regular everyday racism. A woman my age, she said, "So the definition of racism is probably when you impose a bunch of opinions on someone without asking them, based solely on their ethnicity or identity. Like assuming that we really love that Israel is bombing Gaza and we support the government 100% just because we happen to care about the hostages. That's really just general racism." Okay, these were some quotes from the study. My point is that in a time when the concept of antisemitism is being politicized, the way also Feldman showed, it is extremely important that we do not lose track of antisemitism happening on the ground, so to speak. Then we will become paralyzed bystanders. Yeah. I had a question for Feldman, but shall I save it to afterwards, maybe?
Maybe you start the conversation with your question.
I can, oh yes, I can do that. Yep. Okay, thank you. Okay, tack. Okay.
Hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, good. Thank you, David Feldman, for an enlightening discussion about how the concept of racism and anti-Semitism have come to diverge. My background is from memory studies and cultural history. And I have some comments related to what you say about the Holocaust as a Jewish memory and as a shared, universalized moral and historical reference. And as you show, these things don't have to be seen as two separate things. Universalizing perspectives on the Holocaust has been articulated and promoted by Jewish persons and communities. And this has happened also in Norway. And the wider society, the majority population, have adopted these universalizing interpretations of the Holocaust, and this has had several implications. I would like to follow up on your talk by saying a little bit about Holocaust remembrance in a Norwegian Jewish context. After the war, most Norwegian Jews had experienced persecution, great losses of friends, family, relatives, and often also of property. We know that practices of remembrance started very early within the Jewish communities. There is some research on how the communities and how Jewish people in Norway dealt with the losses ritually and socially, but I think this is a topic that would deserve more research. The historian Birkbeck Institute has shown how the establishment of the Israeli state became an important event for Norwegian Jews. Israel became a source of pride and dignity and hope for the future in the post-war years. And at this time, clearly the Jewish communities were maneuvering as a small minority in a society dominated by patriotic understandings of what had happened in Norway during the war. So in this situation, in the general public, guilt, responsibility, and also anti-Semitism was very much pinned on the Nazis. So it took years before the kind of critical self-searching attitude that is more typical for the memory culture in Norway today gained ground in Norway. The American sociologist Jeffrey Alexander has shown how cultural interpretations of the Holocaust changed during the 1960s and 70s. He describes how the Holocaust came to be understood not only as a past evil, as something we overcame in 1945, but as an evil that we cannot truly dissociate ourselves from, an evil that is latent within us as human beings, something that could once again be set in motion under certain social and political circumstances. And this new understanding paved the way for the Holocaust to become an important historical and moral symbol in the Western world. And I would think that such a self-searching attitude that has become influential in Norway, this more complex concept of guilt and responsibility has fostered another kind of willingness to address anti-Semitism and racism in our own society. And perhaps, therefore, I think that evoking the Holocaust still may have the capability to create a common ground for work against racism and anti-Semitism. Still, I think in the situation we are in today, but also generally, that when and if we evoke the memory of the Holocaust, we need to be aware of how people in our society approach this from different positions and with different experiences. The Holocaust is a shared moral and historical point of reference, but it is also a minority memory. In my PhD project, I did interviews with the 13 Norwegian Jews who all had a family history related to the Holocaust. So they had grown up with the Holocaust, with memories of the Holocaust as something that concerned their near relations, family, home environment, something tied to their local environment in Norway and to the Jewish communities. And then in school and other contexts, they got to know the Holocaust as this shared and often mediatized memory, often through films like Schindler's List, for instance. So the participants have experienced how a painful and difficult part of Jewish history began to get more and more exposed and more open to meaning-making in various contexts outside of the family sphere and outside of the Norwegian Jewish communities. And the stories the participants tell me about their encounters with the Holocaust as a public societal memory are often quite ambivalent. These encounters have been quite ambivalent, it appears. And I think I might get back to that ambivalence in the conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Et kvarter på oss.
Okay, I think we take our seats now.
Der var du, Maria.
And as you, Alexa, announced that you would have a question for David, maybe we start with that question and enter the conversation.
Yeah. I was only thinking about the concept of anti-Semitism because I think for a lot of people the benchmark for what is anti-Semitism is very classical stereotypes we know from the, from before. And it's kind of hard to recognize new forms of anti-Semitism. And I know that you were part of a group, the Runnymede Trust, that decided that instead of talking about Islamophobia, you should talk about anti-Muslim racism. And I wondered, is it an idea to more often talk about anti-Jewish racism? I don't mean to replace anti-Semitism as a concept, but just, you know, add some more concepts to it. That was my question.
You're muted.
Thank you.
You didn't have the power to unmute yourself.
And I'll just start by thanking you for those extremely rich responses to what I said. I mean, both are really sort of worthy of lectures in their own right. But moving to your question, I'll start answering it with an anecdote. Certainly the term anti-Semitism, it became clear to me, can be misunderstood. I was asked to speak to a meeting of young black radical Americans. Many of them are involved with churches. And they wanted me to talk about anti-Semitism and Israel and so forth. And it was quite a hostile group. And one woman came up to me afterwards, and she was friendlier than some. And she was training for the Baptist ministry. And she said to me, "Why do you call this thing anti-Semitism? We have, in my country, we have anti-black racism, anti-Mexican racism, anti-Korean racism, and so forth. But you call it anti-Semitism." And in her eyes, this was a way of Jewish people claiming white privilege. They weren't identifying more broadly with racism. I was very taken aback by this. So, but since then, increasingly people have posed the question that you posed. And there are other terms in circulation. In the UK especially, the Jewish press and some Jewish leaders talk about anti-Jewish hate rather than racism, which must go back to the German Judenhass. My own sense is that we're stuck with anti-Semitism. It's the term which has recognition, and that we have. It means something to both. We can't undo the 150 years of history, but I think that the concept of anti-Jewish racism should join all those other concepts that you mentioned, taken from the field of race studies, which can enrich our understanding of anti-Semitism as a phenomenon. But I don't hold out much hope for overthrowing the term. I think there are other, perhaps more urgent battles to fight.
Yeah, I agree.
One interesting point on that is that in the EU, in its action plan against racism, which is now in a way mainstream towards all the EU member states, the definition of racism is composed by, I think, 6 or 7 forms of racism, and among them anti-Jewish racism. So they took this approach, and they now claim from all member states action plans and responses and so on. So it obviously is an approach which at the European Union level seems to be promising to force member states to look at these mechanisms of discrimination, because it's these action plan along the same categories, which also goes back to your point, is the fight against bigotry a fight for equal rights and against discrimination following along some of the same patterns. I start also to include some of the questions I got here, because I think one of the questions after your lecture, when it comes to the present situation and the in a way absurd situation that being in support of Israel is in a way a possible way of whitewashing yourself from anti-Semitism. One question here was like, why does the far right in the West embrace Israel, and how will this affect the struggle against anti-Semitism?
Is that for me?
Yeah,
okay.
Because you mentioned that. I think it
sure. No, I understand.
To this conference.
Yes, I think there is an element. I think on both sides there is a sense in which they think that my enemy's enemy is my friend. So it's sort of driven by an identification of Muslims, whether in Europe or in the Middle East, as the enemy, but whether by the far right in Europe or by those in Israel who invited the far right there. Of course, as well, it's a reflection. Those invitations are a reflection of the distance between Israel and the left that the ministry which extended those invitations to the far right and not to the left. That's where it sees it can find allies, but I think in a way it's a false alliance, in the sense that, clearly there are aspects of the conflict in Israel-Palestine which have to do with religion and with Islamist politics, but it's more extensive than that. It's not really a religious matter. It's a conflict between two nations, and that's not the case in Europe. In Europe, it's a case of intolerance towards minorities. And the other thing which I think is worth saying is that I think the conference in Israel and these invitations clearly have exposed a point of tension between the Israeli government and diaspora Jewry. Many of the leaders of diaspora Jewry who were invited decided not to go to the conference. Some more quickly than others, but however many did refuse to go. So that again, I think, is an important aspect of what is going on at present, although it's not clear that at present it's one incident, not a trend, but it's an interesting development.
Yeah, I would also hand this question on to you, Alexa, because you started in your historical review also, or you touched upon the 1990s, where it was in a way easy to read anti-Semitism when it came from neo-Nazis, and it was so easy, also connected to the Nazi history, to the Holocaust, and so on. Is it more difficult today to read or to decode right-wing anti-Semitism?
Oh yeah, I really do think so. Yeah, it was, I mean, the neo-Nazis in the 80s and 90s, they didn't even try to hide their Nazi ideology. But of course, many of the right-wing parties in Europe today really present themselves as, you know, with a distance to the Nazis. But I think David Feldman is right in saying that they transformed a conflict on territory into a religions or you know, migration discussion in Europe, and I think it's really, really sad and disturbing to see how the rhetorics of the right wing use the Jews or the safety of the Jews in Europe as sort of an alibi or a motive to present their politics of, you know, like anti-migration, anti-Muslimness, etc. They're putting the minorities up against each other. Mm.
So the focus on Israel also can lead to that we lose right-wing anti-Semitism from the radar a little bit. Mm. It's not the focus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which also leads to I think one question here is about this question of solidarity. I think Maria touched upon it. Everyone has touched upon it. Is when we have this description of the left and the Jewish fight against anti-Semitism in a way sliding from each other, is there also a kind of counter-narrative to be traced? I think you mentioned the Black Lives Matter, that also, for example, in the US, many Jewish organizations supported Black Lives Matter. Here in Norway, we had in 2015, when the Islamist terror attack on the synagogue in Copenhagen happened, we had this ring of peace formed by Norwegian Muslims. Is it important to focus on this kind of counter development, and do we have this substantial counter history about solidarity between minorities, not only being like set apart? This is maybe to both David and Alexa, and also Maria, because I think you found quite something about it in your material. Maybe you want to start?
Yes, I can try. I've found many examples of where the participants in my study talked about how they could recognize themselves in other minority groups in Norway or in other minorities' experiences. Norwegian Muslims, Bosnians in Norway, Sami people in Norway, that they could relate their own experiences to the kind of discrimination they had experienced as well. Even if the memory of the Holocaust is for them something particular and complex, a complex part of their identity, it's not something that sort of closes them off from the wider world. That was not my impression. And one of the participants also said that she thought maybe other minorities might be able to understand better the memory of the Holocaust, what significance that had to Jewish people in Norway, because they may also have had experiences of being frightened or being threatened, needing to sort of be careful.
Mm. Mm. So it's about empathy and being able to identify with historical experiences and mechanisms.
No, I just wanted to add that when we did our surveys in 2022 and we had a Muslim sample and a Jewish sample, and a huge majority in both of them asked that they agreed upon that they had similar experiences with discrimination, blah, 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 and that they wanted it's reasonable to fight together against prejudice. But I think the answers now, in the shadow of the war, will look very different for many reasons. But then I just want to, since we are on the end, I really want to say that we have to remind, working at this Holocaust Center with this broad mandate that you started the event with, we have to sort of stick to that comparing different kinds of racism, antisemitism, whatever, is not the same as making them the same phenomenon. Mm. And it's not to say that one is the origin of the other. It's not like antisemitism origined from racism. The point is that to compare gives a broader perspectives. And I think we can narrow that, again, turn it back to a Holocaust Center and the memorials of the Holocaust. That, of course, it's like you said, Maria, it's both a unique and private and personal and a family history, and it's the history of what happened to the Jews, very specifically. But that at the same time, I think that the lesson from the Holocaust really also is that violation against human rights based on ethnicity whatsoever is wrong. And that's a very simple, universal message that I hope we can sort of stick to.
David, is there...
I completely agree with what Alexa has just said, but I think what I want to emphasize is that that place where Alexa ended up does not come from experience alone. It comes from a set of principles.
Yeah.
And that I think one of the difficulties that we have got ourselves into over the last 20 years or so is by putting, as we say in English, putting all of our eggs into one basket, putting all of our eggs into the lived experience basket. And I thought that Alexa spoke really well earlier about the importance of remembering experience when issues of racism and anti-Semitism are so politicized, that remembering there are individuals and humans. But when these become political issues, as inevitably they do, experience is not the be-all and end-all, because it's a political matter, it's an intellectual matter, how people think about their experiences. As was also said, it's natural that inevitable that people compare. But again becomes a political question. How do you compare? Mm. Do you compare to say that my experience or my group's experience is worse? Or do you try to find points of connection based on principles? But the experience itself won't be on its own experience. Appealing to experience will not build solidarity, but I agree that building solidarity is the most important thing that we can do now.
Mm. Which in a way means that it's also a competition about how we frame experience. If we frame it or focus on commonalities or on things which are splitting. But I think the commonalities, I think they are related. We have been into this, like the common mechanisms of discrimination, of bigotry, of hatred. But I have several questions which, in a way, focus on the particularity of anti-Semitism, and several of these are related to the question: has the manifestation of anti-Semitism changed during in recent years, and particularly has it changed, and has there been an impact by the escalating conflict in Gaza?
Okay. Well, a part of my response to that is to say, at a certain level, anti-Semitism is not very interesting. It repeats itself. My colleagues and I at Birkbeck have tried to develop a concept of the reservoir of anti-Semitism, of anti-Semitic narratives and ideas, which is a body of, like a resource within the culture, which builds up over time. Some elements remain, some are added, some drift away. But it gives you, you could call it a reservoir, you could call it a repertoire, which is then mobilized in different political moments for different political causes. So you find very similar ideas being mobilized by the far right and by the far left. So just to give one illustration, when the Labour Party had its series of scandals around and crises around anti-Semitism, while Jeremy Corbyn in the UK was leader of the Labour Party, one of the issues that came up, one of the cases that came up was a Labour Party member who circulated an image from the web of an alien with a Magen David on its back over the Statue of Liberty. And it turned out that this was an image taken from a far-right context that was then used in an anti-Zionist context. So at a fundamental level, I don't think there's anything which is very new. What is new are the political causes, the political moments to which these images and narratives are put to use. But I'll just say one other thing, that there is change over time. Some things do drift away. So, for example, in the early modern period, it was very common to think that Jews had a special smell. And they had this special smell because people believed that they drank the blood of Christian babies. But once the idea of the blood libel began to slip away in the 20th century, the idea that Jews had a special smell was no longer made any sense. So that is one element of anti-Semitism which we don't have to deal with anymore.
I just want to mention that we got a comment which was critical about like this question of a right-left divide when it comes to anti-Semitism, and in a way you just agree to it, that there is this repertoire and there is in a way also this migration of ideas regardless of political direction, but of course the underlying ideological background probably is still different.
Yes, I mean it's a difference between there's a difference between a cultural resource and an ideology. But I agree, yes.
Yeah. We are approaching the end, but we have to 45. I think everyone was informed about that we prolonged with 15 minutes, and I would like to touch one last question because it brings the question of anti-Semitism back to the question of Holocaust remembrance. And this is why it is particularly hurtful when references to the Holocaust are made by left-wing pro-Palestinian defenders. So, for example, the comparison, I think it's about the comparison between Holocaust and Gaza and Nazis and Israel,
yes,
and so on.
Yes.
And I think this is also one probably for Maria.
Yes, I mean, I think that what people are doing there is that they're using something which is particularly painful for Jewish people and using it as a stick with which to beat them. So I absolutely understand why people find that especially painful. There's an argument which people have over whether it is or whether it isn't anti-Semitic, but whether it is anti-Semitic or not doesn't change the fact that it is painful and by and large not a very good analogy through which to understand what is going on in Gaza or on the West Bank. But just maybe I'll just. So I completely agree with that, but I think I just want to push back on one other thing, which is that I want to question the how truly universal Holocaust memory was, and certainly and why it is that the Holocaust has this particular status, and certainly for Black activists and Black intellectuals in the United States. I'm thinking of a book called Irreparable Evil by David Scott. He asked the question, why is it that the Holocaust developed this status, but that the enslavement of Black Africans at the height of the Enlightenment did not raise the same questions at the time? It didn't undermine people's faith in modernity in the same way that the Holocaust has done in the 20th century. And certainly, speaking for the UK, there is certainly a lot of work to be done. The UK is very good and very active in memorializing the Holocaust, and the state plays a strong role there. But it does rather less to commemorate the role of the United Kingdom in the slave trade and in the enslavement of Africans.
Thank you. But that said, it's again not necessary that these things are put up against each other. In the German case, for example, the insight into the genocide on the Herero also gives an insight on, in fact, the prehistory, both the continuity and when it comes to persons, technologies, and so on, leading to the Holocaust. So again, I think we are, prepared to that last question. What do we have to do in order to reframe things that they also can create solidarity? But I would like, Maria, I think you have something about this question of the Holocaust references.
Yes, I was thinking about a woman I interviewed who told me she reflected upon why she avoided participating in public commemorations. And she told me about an experience where she had tried to attend a gathering at the 9th of November commemoration demonstration. where the Palestine Committee appeared, and someone made a comparison between the suffering of the Jews during the Holocaust and the suffering of the Palestinian people. And she sort of, she didn't distance herself categorically from this analogy, actually. She had problems with it, but said that she could sort of understand the logic of it. But she had to leave. She couldn't stay and attend the commemoration. And when we talked about this, she said that she wonders if she would have reacted differently if those who made those comparisons were Palestinians themselves instead of being majority Norwegians. And perhaps that would have meant something to her then as well, but or perhaps that would have made a difference. But I was thinking about this, that if the majority population commemorates the Holocaust in a way that feels alienating to Jewish people in Norway, that is something that should concern us. I think something to take into account.
Yeah. And I think this is something which I have heard from you before, the particular and the universal, when the particular in a way is lost or devaluated, the particular historical experience. Mm. So I think we need to finish, and I have the paper already. So I think we need to take the question, what can we do afterwards in our conversation? But I think the point you made, Maria, was a strong one, which is to see the particular experiences and issues without losing out of sight. I think it was beautiful that this lady was able to see the empathy and recognize other suffering, but also being needed to be acknowledged and recognized in her own experience and traumatic legacy. So I think the question needs to be continued. How can we unite and frame the struggle against antisemitism and against racism with focusing on commonalities without losing the particular experiences out of sight? So thank you very much, David, for being with us, even if only virtually. And thank you very much, Maria and Alexa, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.